The first sign that something was wrong came not with thunder, not with the cracking of the world tree, and not with the howl of any wolf or serpent. It came with silence. Deep in the forests between Midgard and the outer reaches of the Nine Realms, a group of Draugr dead soldiers animated by Norse sorcery, bound to the earth they once bled on, stopped moving. Not because something killed them, because something walked past them, and the wrongness of its presence froze every corrupted instinct they had. They turned slowly, the way dead things turn when they sense something their rotting minds cannot categorize. What they saw was a man in a yellow suit and a white cape, hands in his pockets, looking at the trees with the mild expression of someone who had forgotten why he came outside. He glanced at the Draugr, then back at the trees, then at the Draugr again. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he sighed, not with fear, not with battle hunger, but with the specific, hollow exhaustion of someone who had hoped this trip might finally be interesting. One of the Draugr lunged. The forest went quiet again, but this time it stayed that way. And somewhere deep in Asgard, Odin opened his eye. This is only the beginning. Whatever just entered the Nine Realms did not come with prophecy, and that is the part that should frighten you. If you make it to the end of this story, you will understand why every god in this universe was wrong to think they had seen everything. Subscribe now, because what happens next to Kratos, to Atreus, and to the gods themselves cannot be undone once it starts. Nobody could explain later how he got there. That was the first problem, and in the Nine Realms, unexplained arrivals were not a small matter. Every transition between worlds left a mark, a shimmer in the air, a tear in the fabric of Yggdrasil, a ripple that the Norns could trace backward to its source like pulling a thread from a tapestry. When Bifrost carried a traveler, the sky burned with color. When dark magic tore a passage between realms, the earth remembered the wound for weeks. But when Saitama arrived in Midgard, there was nothing. No light, no sound, no scar in the world. One moment the forest clearing was empty, and the next moment there was a man standing in it, looking around with the slow, evaluating expression of someone who had just stepped off a bus in an unfamiliar neighborhood and was trying to remember which direction the convenience store was supposed to be. He looked at the trees. He looked at the sky, which was the particular shade of gray that Midgard wore in the late afternoon, heavy with the kind of cold that settled into your bones before you noticed it was there. He looked at the ground, which was soft and dark and covered in moss that seemed older than most civilizations. He said out loud to no one, "This doesn't look like the sale." He had been heading to a supermarket. There had been a flyer. The discount on crab was supposedly significant. He was not sure what had happened between leaving his apartment and arriving here, and he spent approximately 4 seconds being mildly puzzled about it before deciding that puzzling about it further was unlikely to help. He had been in stranger situations. He had punched a meteor once. He would figure it out. The Draugr found him before he had taken 20 steps. There were 11 of them, which was more than enough to destroy an entire settlement of mortals, and they moved through the trees with the lurching, deliberate menace of creatures that had been dead long enough to forget what hurrying felt like. They were enormous, each one twice the height of an ordinary man, wrapped in corroded armor, their faces the color of old ash, their eyes burning with the dim greenish light of hell's corrupted energy. They smelled like the inside of something that had been sealed shut for a century. 2 of them were carrying weapons that had crushed stone walls. One of them had what appeared to be an entire tree trunk as a club. Saitama stopped walking and looked at them. They stopped too for just a moment, in the way that predators sometimes pause when instinct sends a signal the brain hasn't caught up to yet. Then the largest one screamed, a sound like tearing iron, and all 11 of them charged at once. The ground shook. Trees cracked from the vibration of their footsteps alone. In any normal confrontation involving any normal warrior, the tactical situation at this moment would have been desperate, requiring immediate retreat or a defensive miracle. Saitama scratched the back of his head. He watched them come. He timed it with the specific half-bored attention of someone trying to decide whether to swat a fly or just wait for it to land somewhere. When the largest Draugr reached him and brought the tree trunk down in an arc that would have leveled a longhouse, Saitama moved his left hand 4 inches and let the strike hit his palm. The tree trunk stopped, not slowly, not with a groan of resistance. It simply stopped, as though it had struck something fundamental and immovable at the center of the universe. The Draugr stared at his own weapon. Saitama looked at him. Then Saitama flicked his wrist, not even a full punch, barely a gesture, the kind of motion you make when you're brushing crumbs off a table, and the Draugr was gone, not knocked back. Gone, a streak across the sky, disappearing above the tree line with a sound like a distant cannon, landing somewhere so far away that the impact wouldn't be found for 3 days. The remaining 10 froze. Saitama looked at them all one by one with the patient, slightly disappointed expression of a man who had hoped this would take longer. It did not take longer. He moved through the group in the time it takes to blink twice, and when he was done, the clearing was quiet, and Saitama was already looking at the sky again, trying to get his bearings. He was not breathing hard. He had not broken a sweat. He had simply finished a minor inconvenience and moved on to the next problem, which was that he still had no idea where he was, and the crab discount was probably already over. What he did not know, what he could not have known, because he had never heard of Yggdrasil or the ravens that served as Odin's eyes across the realms, was that 2 of those ravens had been perched in the branches above the clearing the entire time. They had watched everything, and now they were already flying north, fast and silent, carrying information back to a throne in Asgard where a very old, very intelligent, and very dangerous god was waiting to hear something worth his attention. He was about to hear something worth his attention. Odin did not react to news the way other gods did. Lesser deities, the young ones, the loud ones, the ones who had never lost a war, tended to respond to surprising information with immediate emotion, with anger or fear, or the kind of overconfident dismissal that got pantheons killed. Odin had lived long enough to know that the most dangerous piece of information was not the one that frightened you, but the one that didn't fit any category you already had. When his ravens returned from Midgard and the images settled into his mind, 11 Draugr, a clearing, a man in yellow, 1 gesture, 1 sound, 11 problems becoming 0. He did not stand up from his throne. He did not call for his generals. He sat very still for a long moment in the way that deep water is still, which is to say that the stillness itself was a sign of enormous force operating just beneath the surface. Then he said quietly to the empty hall, "Where did it come from?" The ravens had no answer. That was the second problem, and in Odin's long experience, the second problem was always the one that mattered. He went to the Norns first, because that was the correct procedure when something arrived without explanation. The Norns were the 3 weavers who sat at the base of Yggdrasil and maintained the threads of fate for every being in every realm, gods, mortals, giants, creatures, all of them accounted for, all of them woven into the pattern with a beginning and a direction and an end that could be read if you knew how to look. Odin knew how to look. He had given his eye for that knowledge. He arrived at the roots of the world tree in the cold hour before dawn, and he asked the question directly, because the Norns respected directness and punished those who tried to be clever with them. He asked them to show him the thread belonging to the man in the yellow suit. The Norns looked. They looked for a long time, longer than they had looked for anything in centuries, their fingers moving through the tapestry of fate with the careful urgency of someone searching for a dropped needle in a vast and complicated cloth. Then the oldest of the 3 looked up at Odin with an expression he had never seen on her face before, and she said 2 words that rearranged something fundamental in his understanding of the universe. She said, "No thread." He was not in the weave, not hidden, not obscured, not protected by some rival magic that blocked the Norn's sight, simply absent, as though the loom of fate had been constructed before he existed and had never been updated to account for him, because the loom of fate had been constructed before he existed and had never been updated to account for him. He was not part of the pattern. He was not part of any pattern. He was something that had arrived from outside the system entirely, and the system had no language for that. Odin returned to Asgard and began making decisions with the methodical efficiency of a man who has survived by being faster than catastrophe his entire life. He sent word to Freya, who had her own network of informants in Midgard, and whose knowledge of mortal behavior was more current than his. He did not tell her what he had learned from the Norns, because that information was the kind that changed how people thought, and he needed Freya thinking clearly and not philosophically. He told her only that something unusual had been observed in the forests near the eastern settlements, something that had destroyed 11 Draugr without apparent effort, and that he wanted information before he wanted action. Freya received this message and felt the specific unease of someone who has been given a carefully edited version of a larger truth. Meanwhile in Midgard, Saitama had found a road. It was not a road in any sense he was familiar with: no asphalt, no painted lines, no convenience stores at the intersections. But it was clearly a path that people used, worn smooth by boots and cart wheels, lined on both sides by stones that someone had placed there with intention. He followed it because following roads was logical and because he had nothing better to do. He passed through a small settlement of mortals who stared at him with the frozen, wide-eyed terror of people who had just watched him walk out of a forest that no one walked out of, and he nodded at them politely. One child, too young to know what fear was supposed to look like, waved at him. Saitama waved back. Then he asked the nearest adult in a conversational tone whether there was anything to eat nearby, because he had missed the crab sale and he was getting hungry. The adult in question was a farmer named Björn who had survived 3 Draugr raids, one particularly aggressive troll, and the general ambient danger of living in Midgard during an age of gods and monsters. He had never been asked about food by a man who had just walked out of certain death with his hands in his pockets. He pointed, wordlessly, at the village hall, because pointing was the only response his brain was currently capable of generating. Saitama thanked him and walked in that direction, and Björn stood in the road for a full minute afterward, staring at nothing, before going inside to tell his wife that something had changed in the world, and he wasn't sure what it was, but he was fairly sure it was permanent. He was right. In the grand hall of the village, Saitama sat down, ate what was offered without complaint or particular enthusiasm, and looked out the window at the gray Midgard sky while the villagers arranged themselves in a careful semicircle around him, and whispered to each other with the urgent, frightened energy of people trying to decide whether what they had just witnessed was a miracle or a warning. Nobody asked him directly what he was or where he came from, because the ones who had seen what happened to the Draugr had told the ones who hadn't, and a degree of social caution had descended over the room like a second ceiling. Saitama, for his part, was thinking about whether the sky here reminded him of anything, and concluding that it mostly reminded him of a particularly uninspiring Tuesday. He did not notice the fear in the room. He rarely did. What he noticed for just a moment was that the world felt slightly different here, heavier somehow, more saturated, as though the air itself was older and more serious than the air he was used to. He noticed it, filed it away, and went back to looking at the sky. Somewhere above that sky, in the golden towers of Asgard, Odin was reading reports and making a list of everything he knew and everything he didn't know, and the second list was growing faster than the first. Kratos did not go looking for trouble anymore. That was the thing people who didn't know him failed to understand, and the thing people who did know him understood with a specific, quiet relief. The man who had torn Ares apart with his bare hands, who had killed Poseidon and Hermes and Hephaestus and Zeus, who had dragged himself out of the underworld twice and burned Olympus to the foundation. That man had made a decision somewhere in the cold of Midgard to become something different. Not peaceful exactly, because Kratos was not built for peace in the way that ordinary men were built for it, but contained, deliberate. He chopped wood, he hunted, he trained Atreus, and he kept the violence locked inside himself like a fire in a sealed room, useful for warmth, dangerous if the door opened. He had earned the right to be done with the business of gods. He had paid for it in ways that would take several lifetimes to fully account for. So when the reports reached him, not through any divine channel, because Kratos had severed himself from divine channels as thoroughly as he knew how, but through Atreus, who had heard it from Mimir, who had heard it from a bird, which was how most reliable information moved in the 9 realms, he did not immediately reach for the Leviathan axe. He listened. He sat across the fire from Mimir's head, which hung at his belt, and managed somehow to project an air of scholarly excitement even without a body. And he listened to the description of what had happened in the eastern forest with the specific, measured attention of a man who had learned the hard way that overreacting to strange news was almost as dangerous as ignoring it. Mimir had a great deal to say, because Mimir always had a great deal to say. He said that the Draugr reports were confirmed by 3 independent sources. He said that the figure described, short, completely bald, wearing something that no one in the 9 realms had a word for, moving with a casualness that survivors described as almost insulting, matched nothing in any bestiary, any prophecy, or any historical account he could access, and his access was extraordinary. He said that the Norns had been consulted, which he knew because the disturbance in the weave of fate that followed a consultation of that magnitude had been felt by several practitioners of Sather across 2 realms, and the particular flavor of the disturbance suggested that the Norns had found something they didn't have a category for. He paused here for effect, because Mimir had a theatrical streak that centuries of imprisonment had done nothing to diminish. Then he said, "Big man, I've been alive in one form or another for longer than most mountains, and I have never heard of the Norns failing to find a thread. Every living thing has a thread. That's not a rule someone made up, that's the actual structure of existence." Kratos looked at the fire. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Where is it now?" Mimir said the last confirmed sighting had placed it in a village settlement 2 days' travel to the east, apparently eating. Atreus wanted to go immediately. This was consistent with who Atreus was: curious, eager, drawn toward the strange and the significant, with the magnetic pull of someone who had grown up, understanding that the strange and the significant were usually the same thing. He had Loki's blood and a scholar's instincts, and the specific restlessness of a young person who had already seen enough of the world to know that most of it was more interesting than staying home. He argued that something with no thread in the weave of fate was exactly the kind of thing they needed to understand before Odin understood it, because anything Odin reached first became a weapon or a prisoner, and neither outcome was acceptable. Kratos listened to this argument with the careful attention he always gave Atreus's reasoning, because Atreus was usually right about the logic even when he was wrong about the urgency. He was right about the logic. Kratos picked up the axe. They reached the settlement on the morning of the 2nd day, moving through the forest with the practiced silence of people who had learned that announcing your approach in Midgard was an excellent way to arrive somewhere to find that whatever you were looking for had already left or been eaten. The village was quiet in the particular way that villages became quiet after something unusual had passed through. Not the quiet of abandonment, but the quiet of people who were still processing, still sitting with the feeling of having witnessed something they didn't have the right words for yet. Kratos spoke to the farmer they found nearest the road, a broad-shouldered man named Björn who seemed to have aged several years in the last 48 hours, and who told his story with the careful precision of someone who had been repeating it so many times that it had worn smooth in his memory, every unnecessary detail polished away until only the essential facts remained. A man in yellow walked out of the eastern forest. 11 Draugr, one motion, done. Ate some bread. Asked if there was a market nearby, left to the south. Kratos processed this. Atreus processed this faster, because Atreus processed most things faster, and said, "He asked about a market." Björn confirmed it. Atreus and Mimir exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation about what it meant for something with no thread in the weave of fate to be wandering around Midgard asking about markets. Kratos did not participate in the look. He was already studying the ground where Saitama had walked, reading the earth the way he had been taught to read it, looking for the weight of a warrior in the impression of a footstep. the tension of a body ready for violence in the way boots pressed into soft soil. What he found in the footprints was a completely ordinary gait, no weight displacement suggesting combat readiness, no lateral tension suggesting evasion instinct, just a person walking in the direction they wanted to go with no particular concern about anything in the environment around them. It was the most unsettling thing Kratos had read in a footprint in his entire, very long and exceptionally violent life. Warriors, even relaxed ones, carried their history in the way they moved. Their bodies remembered every fight, every near death, every moment of genuine danger, and that memory lived in the muscles and expressed itself in how they held their weight even when nothing was happening. This person walked like someone who had never, not once in their entire existence, encountered anything that made their body feel it needed to be ready. Kratos stood up from the ground slowly and looked south along the road where Saitama had gone. He said to Atreus quietly, "We follow. We watch. We do not engage unless there is no other option." Atreus nodded, understanding the seriousness in his father's voice, which was a different kind of serious than the serious Kratos usually carried, less like controlled anger and more like genuine uncertainty, which Atreus had seen so rarely that it rearranged his expectations for the day. They followed the road south. Behind them in the village, Björn watched them go and quietly decided that whatever was happening, he was going to start keeping his family closer to the house. Saitama had found a market. It was not the kind of market he was used to, no fluorescent lighting, no shopping carts with the one wheel that always spun sideways, no background music that somebody had decided was relaxing, but wasn't. But it was unmistakably a market in the fundamental sense, which was that people had gathered in one place and were exchanging things for other things, and some of those things were food. He moved through the stalls with his hands in his pockets, looking at the goods with the mild, evaluating expression of a man who had strong opinions about value for money, and was not seeing a great deal of it. The vendors watched him with the barely concealed terror of people who had received word ahead of his arrival, because news in Midgard traveled faster than most people assumed, especially news of the category that made farmers age overnight. They took his money. He had found coins in his pocket that he did not remember putting there, which was strange, but not the strangest thing that had happened today, without argument, without trying to negotiate, without doing anything that might be interpreted as a provocation. One woman selling dried fish simply handed him everything on her table and stepped back 3 feet. Saitama looked at the fish, looked at the woman, said "thank you," and paid her anyway because it seemed like the right thing to do. He was sitting on a low wall at the edge of the market, eating and watching the crowd with the patient, unfocused attention of someone with nowhere specific to be, when he became aware that he was being watched in return. He had a sense for this, not a supernatural sense, nothing as dramatic as that, just the ordinary human awareness of sustained attention from a specific direction, the feeling of eyes that were doing something more deliberate than casual observation. He looked up. Across the market square, half obscured by the crowd, and not making any particular effort to hide, which suggested either confidence or something beyond confidence, stood 2 figures. One was enormous, not in the way that the Draugr had been enormous, not the bloated, corrupted size of dead things grown wrong, but the dense, architectural enormity of something that had been built by extreme experience into its final and permanent shape. Gray skin. A red marking across his face like a wound that had been made into a declaration. Eyes that had the specific quality of having seen everything worth seeing and found most of it deeply unsatisfactory. The other figure was younger, lean, with a bow across his back and an expression of intense, barely contained curiosity that reminded Saitama of the look certain cats got when they spotted something they had never seen before and needed to understand immediately. Between them, hanging at the large one's belt, was what appeared to be a severed head, which was unusual even by the standards of a day that had already contained several unusual things. Saitama finished his food, balled up the wrapper. There was no wrapper, it had been cloth. He set the cloth down neatly on the wall and looked at them directly, because he had never seen the point in pretending you hadn't noticed someone noticing you. He raised one hand in a small wave. The younger one's expression shifted immediately into something that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite making it. The large one did not react at all, which was its own kind of reaction, and Saitama recognized this because he had met people before who used stillness as a form of communication. He got up from the wall and walked toward them, because the alternative was sitting there waiting for something to happen, and experience had taught him that waiting for things to happen was usually less efficient than walking toward them. Kratos watched him come and performed the fastest and most comprehensive threat assessment of his life. He had faced Baldur, who could not feel pain. He had faced Zeus, who contained the power of the sky. He had faced the world serpent, whose coils encircled creation. None of those encounters had produced in him this specific feeling, which was not fear exactly. Kratos had a complicated relationship with fear that had lasted decades and resulted in something that functioned more like caution than anything else, but was the recognition of a category of thing he did not have existing framework for. The man walking toward him across the market square was short, with a face that expressed nothing more alarming than mild interest, dressed in something yellow that had no cultural or martial context Kratos could identify. He moved with the complete absence of combat tension that the footprints had already suggested, every step loose and unhurried, not the looseness of someone who was relaxed because the situation was safe, but the looseness of someone to whom the concept of a situation being unsafe had not meaningfully applied in a very long time. Kratos had that looseness himself, sometimes on his best days. He recognized it. He also recognized that in himself, it was the product of extraordinary hard-won capability, and the question of what had produced it in this person was the most important question he had encountered in years. Mimir characteristically spoke first. He said, "Well, good morning to you, friend. You're a hard man to get information about, which is saying something given the company I keep." Saitama looked at the head with the specific, carefully composed expression of someone choosing not to ask about something because asking would require a longer conversation than they currently had energy for. He said, "Sorry, are you okay?" Mimir blinked. In his extremely long experience, that was not typically the first question. He said, more or less, all things considered." Saitama nodded, accepting this, and looked up at Kratos with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who was simply trying to figure out whether this was a person or a problem. He said, "You were watching me for a while back there. Did you need something?" Kratos looked at him for a moment before answering, taking the measure of a question that was so simple it had arrived on the other side of simple and become strange again. He said, "We are here to understand what you are." Saitama considered this. He said, "I'm a hero from Z-City." He paused. He looked around at Midgard, at the gray sky and the wooden stalls and the people watching from careful distances. He said, "Which I'm starting to think is pretty far from here." Atreus, who had been silent through this entire exchange with the coiled energy of someone who had too many questions and was trying to prioritize them, said, "Where did you come from? How did you get here? The Norns have no record of you, which means you're not supposed to exist in this realm, and that means either you came through a gate we don't know about or you came from somewhere outside the 9 realms entirely." He said all of this very quickly, the way people talked when they were more curious than cautious. Saitama looked at him. He said, "I was going to a sale. Crab was on discount." There was a silence. Atreus opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at his father with an expression that said he was not sure whether this was the most important answer they had ever received or the least useful one, and was increasingly concerned it might be both. Kratos said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at Saitama with the eyes of a man who had spent his entire life reading opponents, their weight, their readiness, the violence they carried visibly or otherwise, and finding in this person a perfect, unbroken blankness where all of that information should have been. Not emptiness, not absence, something that was full of something he had no instrument to measure. He said, finally, "Walk with us." It was not a question. Saitama shrugged and fell into step beside them, and the three of them moved out of the market and onto the road heading north, and the crowd parted around them with the silent, unanimous instinct of people who understood, without being told, that whatever was happening between these three figures was something they should not be close to when it finished resolving itself. Odin had decided, after considerable thought, that the correct first response was not an army. An army was a statement of intent, and statements of intent revealed information about what you knew and what you feared, and Odin was not yet ready to reveal either of those things. What he sent instead was Thor. This was not, strictly speaking, a subtle choice, because Thor was not a subtle instrument by any definition that the word subtle had ever carried, but it was a calculated one. Thor was not being sent to win. Thor was being sent to measure. There was a difference, and Odin understood it even if Thor, characteristically, would not, and that gap between understanding and execution was something Odin had already accounted for in his calculations. If Thor succeeded, the problem was solved. If Thor failed, and Odin's eye had looked at that footprint report and the Norn consultation, and had privately begun to construct a model of probability that suggested failure was the more likely outcome, then the nature and manner of that failure would tell Odin more about what he was dealing with than any reconnaissance could. Thor was, in this specific deployment, a very expensive measuring device. Odin felt no particular guilt about this. Thor received his instructions with the selective attention he gave most things, which meant he heard the parts that interested him and processed the rest as background. What interested him was that something had destroyed 11 Draugr without effort, and that Odin wanted it found. What he processed as background was the part about observation, the part about restraint, the part about returning with information rather than a result. He flew south from Asgard on a trajectory that did not particularly concern itself with subtlety, because Thor's approach to most situations was that the loudest path was usually the fastest one, and he had not yet encountered a situation that had conclusively proven this wrong, which meant the lesson remained unlearned. Mjolnir hummed in his grip with the specific frequency it adopted when its wielder was moving towards something it recognized as a worthy target, and Thor took this as confirmation that he was going in the right direction. He found them on the northern road, 3 figures, one of them immediately recognizable as Kratos, which complicated things in a way Thor filed away for later processing, and one of them small and yellow and walking with its hands in its pockets in a manner that Thor found immediately and personally irritating without being entirely sure why. He came down out of the sky the way he always came down, which was at speed, with Mjolnir extended, generating a shockwave on impact that cracked the road surface for 30 meters in every direction and sent a column of displaced air outward like a horizontal storm. Trees on both sides of the road bent away from the impact point. The ground shook. Kratos stepped to one side and braced with the automatic competence of someone who had been managing Thor's entrances for longer than was strictly fair. Atreus dropped low and got his bow up. Mimir said something colorful that got lost in the noise. Saitama stopped walking and looked at the crater where the road used to be. He looked at Thor, who was standing in the center of it with Mjolnir crackling and his red cape moving in the residual wind, projecting the absolute maximum of divine intimidation, with the practiced ease of someone who had been the most powerful thing in most rooms for his entire life. Saitama's expression did not change in any meaningful way. He tilted his head slightly to one side, the way people did when they were trying to figure out if something they were looking at was interesting or just loud. He said, "Was that on purpose?" Thor stared at him. In his experience, the correct response to his arrival was either immediate deference or immediate aggression, both of which he knew how to handle. This mild, questioning tone from something that looked like a bored pedestrian did not slot into any existing response category. He said loudly because loud was Thor's default register, "I am Thor Odinson, god of thunder, son of Odin. I have come for the creature that walks without fate." He raised Mjolnir. Lightning gathered in the clouds above with the speed of divine command, great crackling columns of it reaching down from the sky like the fingers of something vast and electrical. Identify yourself, or face the consequences of my father's displeasure. Saitama looked at the lightning. He looked at Mjolnir, he looked at Thor. He said, I'm Saitama, I'm a hero. A pause. For fun. Thor processed this for a moment, found it unsatisfactory, and threw Mjolnir. Not a test throw, not a ranging shot. A full-force, divine intent strike with the hammer that had cracked mountain ranges and redirected rivers, moving fast enough that even Kratos tracked it as a blur rather than a projectile. It crossed the distance between them in less time than it takes to decide to blink. It hit Saitama in the chest. Saitama rocked back half a step. His left foot slid 2 inches in the dirt of the road. He looked down at his chest with the expression of someone who has just been lightly bumped into on a crowded street, slightly surprised, not particularly concerned. He looked up at Thor, who was staring at him from across the crater with an expression that was making a very difficult journey from absolute confidence to something much less comfortable. Mjolnir reversed course and flew back to Thor's hand, and Thor caught it automatically, the catch purely mechanical while his brain was occupied with processing what his eyes had just told him. Saitama said, You've got a pretty strong throw. He straightened his cape, which had been slightly displaced by the impact. He said, Did you want to talk? Or, he did not finish the sentence because Thor, operating now from the part of his psychology that responded to uncertainty with escalation, threw himself forward with Mjolnir raised, calling down a full lightning strike simultaneously, the combined force of it enough to level a fortress. Kratos said very quietly to Atreus, Do not interfere. Atreus, who had his bow up and had been tracking the exchange with the focused intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail, lowered it slightly without looking away. What happened next lasted approximately 4 seconds and was difficult to describe with precision because most of it moved faster than witness testimony could reliably capture. Thor struck. The lightning struck. The road, the trees, the surrounding earth absorbed approximately everything that the environment was capable of absorbing, and more. And the shockwave that expanded outward from the point of contact knocked Atreus backward 2 steps, despite the distance involved, and cracked 3 of the oldest trees on the road like dry kindling. Mimir was yelling something. Kratos planted his feet and held. The dust and the thunder expanded outward, and then, because physics required it, contracted. When it settled, Thor was standing in a new and larger crater, breathing hard, his armor showing stress fractures along the left pauldron, his expression cycling through stages of disbelief, with the grinding, reluctant quality of machinery processing a result it was not designed to produce. Saitama was standing 8 feet away from him, in exactly the same posture he had been in before, hands half raised in the defensive position he had adopted when Thor charged, looking at Thor with the specific expression of someone who has been mildly jostled and is waiting politely for the other person to collect themselves. He had not punched back. He had simply stood there and taken everything Thor had, and the everything had not been enough. Thor's hand tightened on Mjolnir. For the first time in a very long time, the god of thunder did not know what to do next. Kratos, watching from the road, said nothing. But his jaw was set in the way it's set when he was confronting something that required him to update a fundamental assumption, and the assumption being updated was one he had held since before he left Olympus. He had believed, in the quiet architecture of his worldview, that he was the ceiling, that whatever else existed in whatever realm, he represented something close to the upper limit of what a being could be without becoming abstract. He was updating that belief now, with the careful, reluctant precision of a man pulling out a load-bearing wall and hopping the structure held. Atreus looked at his father. Kratos looked at Saitama. Saitama looked at Thor and said, "Are you done? I don't want to hurt you." Thor's eye twitched. Above them in the clouds, the lightning flickered and went quiet, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing anyone on that road had heard all day. Thor did not leave immediately. That was the part that surprised Kratos, because Thor's usual response to a situation he couldn't dominate was to escalate until dominance became possible or retreat, until a better angle presented itself. And neither of those things happened. Instead, Thor stood in the crater he had made and looked at Saitama with the specific, heavy expression of a man performing an internal calculation that was returning results he didn't want but couldn't argue with. The stress fractures in his armor were real. The effort in his breathing was real. Everything he had brought to this road, the full measure of his divine strength, the lightning, the hammer, the weight of Asgardian power behind every strike had connected, had landed, had been real and present and enormous, and the person across from him was standing in the same posture he had been in when it started. Thor was not stupid, whatever his reputation suggested. He was impulsive and loud and operated with the confidence of someone who had never needed to develop a second gear, because the first gear had always been sufficient. But he was not stupid. He understood what the evidence in front of him meant. He just needed a moment to decide what to do with that understanding. He looked at Kratos. Kratos looked back at him with the neutral expression he used when he was waiting for someone to arrive at a conclusion he had already reached. There was history between them, complicated, violent history, the kind that left permanent marks on both parties and on the landscape where it had occurred. But in this specific moment, that history was secondary to the shared experience of standing on the same road and watching the same impossible thing. Thor said in a voice pitched low enough that it wasn't a proclamation. "What is it?" Kratos said. "We do not know yet." Thor looked back at Saitama, who had taken a few steps to one side and was examining the damage to the road with the mild, assessing expression of a building inspector noting structural concerns. He said, "It doesn't fight back," Kratos said. "It chose not to." This distinction landed on Thor with visible weight, because the difference between cannot and chose not was the difference between a wall and a door. And Thor had just spent everything he had throwing himself at what he had assumed was a wall. Mimir, who had been conspicuously quiet during the combat, which for Mimir represented extraordinary self-discipline, said, "If I might offer a small observation, what we've just witnessed is not simply a being of great strength. What we've witnessed is a being for whom the concept of great strength has become functionally meaningless, because the scale at which it operates makes our entire framework of measuring strength irrelevant. It's like asking how much a mountain weighs and being surprised that the scale breaks." Thor turned to look at Mimir with the expression he reserved for information he found philosophically offensive. He said, "It's a mortal. It looks like a mortal." Mimir said, "Aye, and Yggdrasil looks like a tree." Thor had no immediate response to this, which was rare enough to be noteworthy. Saitama had finished examining the road damage and walked back toward the group with the relaxed, purposeful gait of someone returning to a conversation they hadn't finished. He looked at Thor, then at Kratos, then at Atreus, making the round of eye contact in the way someone did when they were trying to read the room and finding the room more complicated than expected. He said to the group generally, "So what is this place exactly? I've been walking around all day and everything is very dramatic and slightly cold and nobody will tell me straightforwardly where I am." Atreus, who had lowered his bow entirely now and was watching Saitama with the focused, cataloging attention of a scholar encountering a primary source, said, "You're in Midgard, one of the 9 realms, connected to each other through Yggdrasil, the world tree." He paused, reconsidering his audience. "Think of it as there are 9 worlds, and this is the one where most humans live." Saitama nodded slowly, processing this. He said, 9 worlds. He looked at the sky. He said, "So there's no train back?" It was not a question. Atreus said carefully, "Not exactly, no." Saitama absorbed this information with the patience of someone who had long ago made peace with situations not resolving the way he had hoped and said, "Okay. Just okay." The single most understated response to learning you were stranded in a mythological alternate dimension that anyone in the 9 realms had ever heard. Thor, who had been watching this exchange with mounting frustration at its failure to be properly dramatic, said, "This is not a conversation. This thing appeared without explanation, destroyed Draugr without effort, withstood my full strike, and now it wants directions. My father will want answers, Kratos said. Your father will want control. There is a difference. Thor's expression tightened because this was true and he didn't want it to be. Kratos turned to look at Saitama directly and said, in the careful, level voice he used when he was communicating something important to someone he was not yet sure understood the stakes, Odin knows you are here. He is the ruler of Asgard and he controls much of what happens across these realms. He will send more than thunder next time. Saitama looked at him. He said, is that a warning? Kratos said. It is a fact. Saitama considered this for a moment. He said, I'm not really looking for trouble, I just need to figure out how to get home. He paused. He looked at Thor. He said, does your dad know how to get between worlds? Thor said slowly and with the air of someone answering a question they found deeply strange. He has the ravens. The ravens see everything across all realms. Saitama said, so he might know how I got here. He said it with the simple, practical logic of someone following a problem to its most obvious next step. And the simplicity of it was somehow more disorienting than anything that had come before. Because here was a being that had just absorbed everything the god of thunder could produce. And its primary interest was not power or dominance or divine recognition, but finding a way home. The same way a person who had gotten turned around on an unfamiliar road was primarily interested in getting unturned around. Kratos looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Atreus, who gave the smallest nod, the agreement between them running on the frequency they had developed over years of shared danger. He looked at Thor, who was still processing, still recalibrating, his whole body carrying the unfamiliar weight of having been the second strongest thing on a road. He said, we will go to the realm between realms. There are answers there that Odin cannot intercept. Thor said, you would take it there. Kratos said, I would take him there. Because the alternative is leaving him walking around Midgard alone, and the longer he walks, the more of Odin's attention he draws, and Odin's attention is something none of us can afford in large quantities right now. Thor looked at Saitama one final time, measuring him with the eyes of a god who was very slowly and very painfully understanding that measurement was no longer a useful tool. Then he turned and walked away without another word, lifting into the sky with a crack of displaced air, heading back north and back to Asgard to deliver a report that he was already dreading. Saitama watched him go. He said, to no one in particular, he seems like he's having a rough day. Mimir made a sound that was either agreement or suppressed laughter or possibly both. They began walking, all of them, in the direction Kratos had indicated. And the road behind them held the evidence of what had happened in the cracked stone, and the scorched earth, and the three ancient trees lying across the verge like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had just fundamentally changed the conversation. Above them, the gray sky of Midgard sat heavy and unchanged, indifferent to the shift in the order of things happening beneath it, the way skis always were. The way they would continue to be regardless of what any god or mortal or inexplicable yellow-suited anomaly decided to do next. The path to the realm between realms did not announce itself. There was no gate, no arch, no divine mechanism that hummed with obvious supernatural energy. There was a lake, frozen at the edges and dark at the center, and a boat that Kratos had clearly used before, and a silence over the water that was different from ordinary silence in the way that very old things were different from ordinary things. Not visibly, not loudly, but in the specific quality of the air around them, as though the atmosphere itself was older here and had been doing its job long enough to have gotten very serious about it. Saitama sat in the bow of the boat with his hands on his knees and watched the dark water move past, and did not ask how a lake in the middle of a forest connected to the space between worlds, because he had stopped requiring explanations for the mechanism of things, and had started simply observing what the things did. This was a skill he had developed over a long period of increasingly strange professional experience, and it served him reasonably well. Kratos rode. He rode the way he did most physical things, which was with complete efficiency and no wasted motion, each stroke pulling the boat forward with a steadiness that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with the deep, practiced competence of someone who had been moving through difficult terrain for so long that the movement itself had become a form of thought. Atreus sat at the stern with his notebook open. He kept a notebook, had kept one for years, filling it with observations and translations, and the kind of marginal notes that accumulated when a person was trying to understand a universe that kept producing new categories, and was writing quickly, his eyes moving between the page and Saitama with the rhythm of someone who was trying to capture something before it changed. Mimir had gone quiet again, which meant he was either thinking very hard or listening very carefully, and the difference between those two states was not always visible from the outside. Saitama said after a while, "Your kid takes a lot of notes." Kratos said without breaking the rhythm of his rowing, "He is trying to understand you." Saitama said, "I'm not that complicated." Kratos said, "No, you are not." He said it without irony, without the weight of a deeper meaning intended to land later. He said it as a plain observation, which was somehow more interesting than any elaborate statement would have been, because Kratos had spent his entire life surrounded by things that were enormously, catastrophically complicated, gods with centuries of grievance, prophecies with 17 interpretations, divine politics with the structural complexity of collapsed architecture. And the thing sitting across from him in the boat was, at the level of motivation and personality and desire, genuinely, straightforwardly simple. It wanted to go home. It had no agenda. It asked about markets. This simplicity did not make it less dangerous. In Kratos' experience, the simplest forces were frequently the most dangerous, because complicated things had complicated failure modes and simple things did not. The lake ended where logic suggested it shouldn't have been able to end, opening into something that was not water and not air, and not any of the intermediate substances that existed between those categories, but a space that seemed to operate on the agreement of everyone present that it was navigable and therefore was. The realm between realms looked different depending on where you entered it and what you needed from it, which was either its most useful or most unsettling quality depending on your disposition toward ambiguity. What it showed them today was a corridor of light and shadow that moved like slow smoke, the branches of Yggdrasil visible on all sides as enormous dark shapes pressing against the edges of the space like trees seen through fog, present and structural, but not quite reachable. The air had a quality of held breath. Sound traveled differently here, arriving slightly after it should have, as though the realm was transcribing rather than transmitting. Saitama looked around with genuine attention, the most focused he had been since arriving, his eyes moving across the shadows and the light and the vast slow presence of the world tree with the expression of someone who has finally encountered something that qualifies as interesting. He said, "This is different." Atreus said, "This is the space that connects all realms. Yggdrasil holds everything together from here." He was watching Saitama's reaction with the intensity of a person who had asked a question and was waiting for the answer to appear in someone else's face. Saitama said, "So this is like the middle," Atreus said, "more or less." Saitama nodded. He reached out and touched the nearest tendril of light, the way you touched something in a store to understand its texture without intending to buy it. The light responded not dramatically, not with the full resonant consequence of a divine being making contact with the connective tissue of existence, but with a small, distinct pulse that moved outward through the corridor like a ripple on water, traveling away from his fingertip and disappearing into the deeper dark of the space. Atreus and Kratos both watched it go. Mimir said, very quietly, "That should not have happened." Kratos said, "What should not have happened?" Mimir said, "The tree responded to him. Yggdrasil responds to divine beings, to beings of fate, to the forces written into the weave. It does not respond to, it has no mechanism for responding to something with no thread, because something with no thread has no relationship to the tree at all. It exists entirely outside the system." He paused. And yet, the ripple had not stopped. It was still moving, somewhere deep in the structure of the world tree, a signal traveling through roots that connected everything, carrying the information of a single touch from a single fingertip belonging to a person who was not supposed to be able to make contact with anything in this system at all. Kratos said, "What does it mean when the tree responds to something it has no record of?" Mimir said, "Honestly, big man, I have absolutely no idea, and that answer terrifies me more than most things I've said in my very long life." Saitama had pulled his hand back and was looking at his fingertip with mild curiosity. He said, "Did I break something?" Mimir said, "Define break." Saitama said, "Is it going to cause a problem?" Mimir thought about this with visible effort and said, "Potentially for everyone, Saitama said, "Sorry." He said it with genuine, uncomplicated sincerity, the apology of someone who had bumped into a shelf and knocked something off it without meaning to, and the sincerity of it was somehow more alarming than any amount of deliberate divine interference would have been, because deliberate interference had motivation behind it, and motivation was something you could read and respond to. Accidental disruption of the fundamental connective structure of all existence was a different category of problem entirely. Deep in the roots of the world tree, something shifted. Not broke, not yet, but shifted. The way a foundation shifted when new weight was placed on it by something the engineers had not accounted for when they drew the original plans. The branches above the corridor trembled with the slow, enormous patience of things that had been still for a very long time and were now, reluctantly and with great consequence, beginning to move. Kratos felt it through the hull of the boat, through the water that was not water, through the soles of his feet and up through the dense architecture of his body, the specific vibration of something structural rearranging itself. He had felt this before when Fimbulwinter came, when Ragnarök began, when the things that were supposed to stay fixed began moving. He recognized the quality of it. He gripped the oars. He said, "We need to find the source point of his arrival, quickly." Atreus was already moving, pulling out a different instrument, something older and more precise than the notebook, something Kratos recognized as a tool for reading Yggdrasil's structure directly. He pressed it against the hull of the boat and waited. The instrument responded immediately, more strongly than it had ever responded to anything Atreus had used it on, the needle spinning and then locking onto a direction with the absolute certainty of something that had found a signal so clear it didn't need to search. Atreus looked up. He said, "It came from outside." Kratos said, "Outside which realm?" Atreus said, "Outside all of them. Outside Yggdrasil entirely." The silence that followed this was the kind of silence that preceded a fundamental reclassification of the problem. Saitama, who had been listening to all of this, said, "So I didn't come through a door," Atreus said slowly. "No, you didn't," Saitama said. "I just arrived." Atreus said, "Yes." Saitama looked at the dark branches of the world tree pressing against the edges of the realm and said, with the philosophical equanimity of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by his own existence, "That sounds about right." The boat moved on through the light and shadow. The world tree continued to tremble at a frequency no instrument in any realm had ever been built to measure, carrying the signal of one touch from one fingertip outward through every root and every branch, all the way to the edges of everything, and then, because there was nowhere else for it to go, back again.